how complacency and the mindset of officers and inmate manipulation fit with the Alcatraz escape of 1962 and the Clinton correctional escape of 2015. Now, a lot of you are probably saying right now, how can you even compare a 1962 Alcatraz escape to the Clinton escape 53 years later? Well, I'm going to tell you, even with the technology we have today, 53 years later, we have motion detectors, we have cameras, we have drones that we can use to go around and provide above air security for our prisons. We have cell check devices that can tell us when the officers actually checked cells. We have cameras. We have all these up-to-date new technologies that really work if you use them. We have metal detectors. We have icon scan machines. We have body x-ray machines. Yet, there is one common denominator that has never changed between the escape from Alcatraz and the escape from Clinton Correctional Institution in 2015. And that is the human element. We will always have correctional officers providing care, custody, and control of inmates with direct supervision with the inmates, direct contact with the inmates, and the human element is always there. And the inmates know that. And the inmates will use the complacent officer as their tool, as their weapon to get out or make an escape. They will use inmate manipulation tactics to help them get what they need for their escape. And that, my friends, in 53 years has never changed. And that's what we want to talk about today. And it is kind of eerie how similar the Alcatraz escape was to the Clinton Correctional escape. In both escapes, the inmates had planned for about 6 months. They had planned their escape for about 6 months. So let's talk about these things. We'll start with Alcatraz, and then we'll move in to Clinton Correctional Institution. And remember one thing, mindset. Did the officers at Alcatraz prison in San Francisco Bay have the mindset that no one can escape this place, no one will ever make it across that water, and did that make them fall into complacency? Just something to think about. And with the Clinton Correctional Institution, in its 150-year existence, no one had ever escaped that prison. That's a good record. That's a good thing until the escape in 2015 from Clinton Correctional Institution with Richard Matt and David Sweet. Okay, so was there a mindset in the officers, or some of the officers at Clinton Correctional Institution, that no one's ever escaped this prison in 150 years, and no one ever will? Did that make certain officers become complacent? And why do I say certain officers? Because we cannot say that all officers at Alcatraz and all officers at Clinton Correctional Institution were complacent, okay, or were able to be manipulated by the inmates, because not all officers are that way. The dormitory that the inmates escaped from at Clinton Correctional Institution, those officers cannot represent all the officers at Clinton Correctional Institution, because there's a lot of good officers there at Clinton. And the area that the inmates escaped out of at Alcatraz, those officers, we're going to talk about what they did not do. And we don't have to have been there in 1962 to see clearly that many things were missed at Alcatraz. But those officers that miss those things do not represent all the officers at Alcatraz. Let's keep that in mind as we discuss these things. Okay, let's go to Alcatraz, which was built in 1934, I believe. Yes, 1934. An older type, older style prison. And the inmates that escaped from there were the England brothers, John and Clarence England, born in Georgia, and then moved to Ruskin, Florida, just down the road from me, where they were at the tomato capital of the world, and they were farmers. They worked farm labor. They did farm labor work for a living, but they were also robbers and thieves. And they actually ended up in Florida State Prison up the road from me, a few hours. Their hometown is only 45 minutes from me, Ruskin, Florida. And they spent time in the Florida State prison system. They spent time in the Georgia prison system, and then they ended up at Alcatraz. Okay, and the other escapee from Alcatraz was Frank Morris. And Frank Morris had an IQ of 133. He was said to be an exceptionally smart inmate, and believed to be the mind master behind the escape of Alcatraz. Okay, now the eerie comparison to Alcatraz and Clinton Correctional is that the inmates in both cases had made holes in their cell walls to escape. And in the Alcatraz case, the three inmates had obtained or made a homemade drill made from a broken vacuum cleaner, and they used that drill to loosen the air vents inside their cells. And then they used spoons and other things they could find to carve out a hole big enough for them to get through. Now, they covered these holes with cardboard and pieces of an old suitcase. Now, the cells in Alcatraz were not that big. They were 9 feet by 5 feet and only 7 feet high. Here's a photo to indicate to you how small these cells were. Now, although Alcatraz had strict security measures that there would be 12 inmate checks a day, they seem to have not done their cell security checks. Because in a cell of this size and so small, and a piece of cardboard covering the cell holes, the holes they had dug through their cells through the ventilation, no one ever caught that. In all this time that they were planning and practicing their escape and covering these holes, no one ever caught these holes being dug out through the cell walls. Who was doing cell searches at Alcatraz? Why had the officers become so complacent that no one could see these pieces of cardboard? No one could see these pieces of suitcases. No one could see or find the holes in their cells. Now, that's not all of it, folks. They had built 3 dummy heads, and they made these dummy heads and they colored them with paint, skin tone paint, and they used real human hair. They had contraband all over their cells. This is obvious. We don't have to be a top-notch investigator to know that they had contraband in their cells. And they had an escape route in their cells. And at no time did any officer catch any of this contraband or discover the dummy heads. This is not to say, at the least, they also had 50 raincoats that they'd stolen, and they'd had a little area inside Alcatraz where they were making their raft with these 50 raincoats, making their escape raft, and they had wooden paddles that they had made. Okay, now, during all of this time, none of this contraband was discovered. Complacency kills, is what we always say today in our corrections world, and the military also uses that term. Complacency kills. Complacency allows inmates to get away with things they should not be getting away with. Complacency is not doing your cell searches, not looking for contraband, not doing your job, which allows the inmates to do all these things that they did at Alcatraz, and none of it ever was discovered. Just one cell search. One cell search, a good cell search, would have stopped this escape in its tracks. They would have discovered the holes in the cells being worked on. They would have discovered missing items, the missing raincoats. No shakedowns of the prison apparently were being done. And this all led to the escape of Alcatraz, which became one of the most famous escapes ever in the history of prison escapes. So we have several factors here. We have the fact that complacency had to have taken place, in my opinion, at Alcatraz. Because if officers were on the ball and doing their job, they would have stopped this escape. They would have found the contraband. Now, there's also allegations by a cousin of Frank Morris, Bud Morris, who stated after the escape that 8 or 9 of the officers were paid money to turn their heads or ignore. Now, this was never confirmed. I've looked at some of the FBI records, and you know, when you look at the investigation of Alcatraz, it's mostly about after the escape, hunting them down, trying to find them. Did they die in the bay trying to get across? Did their raft fall apart and they drown? There's allegations that a boat was seen, a strange boat in the bay that same night they escaped, okay, on June 11th, 1962. They weren't discovered to be missing until the morning of June 12th, 1962. Very similar to what happened at Clinton. And to this day, there's a lot of people that say they survived and they made it and they came back home to Ruskin on occasions. People claim that's happened. We don't know for sure, but we don't have any real solid investigations on what went wrong inside the prison, which I would love to have and love to look at. But without having that, it's very easy for me, in my opinion, to say that the complacency of the officers was definitely there. And in my opinion, their mindset was no one can escape from Alcatraz, therefore they slacked up on their cell searches and their security checks. Although the Alcatraz authorities will tell you they had very strict measures at 12 times a day inmates would be checked. And you know, there's a thing that we always go by. You must see the skin of the inmate when you do your cell checks. And they did see some skin, but it was the dummy heads that were painted with the skin tone color paint. Apparently nobody ever checked by shaking the inmates or touching the inmates physically, obviously, or they would have known that they were dummies in there. So complacency took place. Did inmate manipulation take place? Well, if the officers were paid, and that's never been proven, by the way, that allegation, if the officers were paid, as Bud Morris, the cousin of escapee Frank Morris, claims, then inmate manipulation did take place. Somehow these 3 escapees at Alcatraz became friends with certain officers, and they were paid to turn their heads, but we will never really ever be able to prove that part. Okay, so they also went through their air vents when they escaped and climbed up the pipes to the rooftop to a ventilator pipe where they came out up on top of the rooftop. And from there, they shimmied down a stove pipe from the bakery, and then they went over a fence with their equipment, with the raft they had built, with the paddles, and made it to the water. And from there, you know, we never know if they lived or survived. But what I'm trying to get across today is mindset will destroy you as a correctional officer if you have the wrong mindset. Complacency will destroy you as an officer if you fail to do your job properly, as I believe was done in the case of Alcatraz. I believe the officers became very complacent, felt there was no way the inmates could escape, and failed to do their cell searches, cell checks, and properly conduct their 12 inmate checks per day. Obviously, that's pretty easy to surmise because the inmates had all this contraband and successfully escaped. Okay? Now let's go to Clinton Correctional Institution. Very similar events. The two inmates, Richard Matt and David Sweet, started their plans 6 months ahead, just as in Alcatraz. They collected their items in a little different manner. They used inmate manipulation. Joyce Mitchell, a vocational instructor at the tailor shop, here she is, when she was sentenced to 7 years prison. She was the classic weakest link in the civilian employee chain at the prison. Inmates always look for the weakest link, low self-esteem, someone that looks like they need a boost in their morale. And Richard Matt and David Sweet knew right away she was a great target and they needed help to escape. And they told her how beautiful she looked. They found out that she loved her animals, that she loved her dogs, and they drew pictures for her, gave her notes and pictures, talking her up, making her feel good, which inmates do. That's part of the inmate manipulation. They started out small and moved up, and then they ended up having sex with Joyce Mitchell. They ended up having her agree to bring in tools for them. Some of the tools she got in through food items, hamburger meat, a cake one time, I believe, and she gave that to an officer, Gene Palmer, to take to the inmates. Gene Palmer was also bringing in paints and items and allegedly bringing in alcohol to the two inmates in exchange for artwork that he accepted from them and took home. Gene Palmer was almost a 30-year veteran, and it just goes to show you that it doesn't matter how long you've been a prison officer, 1 year or 30 years, if you let your guard down and become complacent, you open yourself to inmate manipulation. Gene Palmer was the other weakest link in the correctional officer chain at Clinton Correctional Institution. And inmates Matt and Sweet could see that. Inmates are always watching and looking for the weakest link. And Gene Palmer was their man. And they played him up and to a T. And they used Joyce Mitchell and Gene Palmer to escape. Now, the complacency part comes in, again, at Clinton, just like Alcatraz. I, for one, will never be convinced, no one can ever tell me that in this one dorm, the officers were not complacent. Again, remember, this is a huge prison, Clinton Correctional Institution. Okay, and it was built many, many years ago. I think it was 1845 when it was built. I could be wrong on that, but I think it was 1845. But it is a huge prison that has many, many, many officers and many inmates. Alcatraz only held about 312 inmates. It was the supermax prison of its time. Clinton Correctional Institution housed many inmates, many more inmates. I believe it was somewhere around 2,900 inmates it could house. So a huge difference in the size. But with the dorm that they escaped from, Matt and Sweeney, the officers could not have been doing their cell checks. They could not have been doing their cell searches. How could you be doing your cell searches when the inmates had all these paintings going on and all these contraband items for paintings? They had the holes in their cell walls. Okay? How could you not do a cell search? And how could you do a cell search and not find those holes in the wall? Complacency set in. Mindset again. Did the officers in that dorm at Clinton Correctional Institution feel no one's escaped this place in 150 years? They're not going to escape now. Mindset, complacency for Clinton Correctional Institution, and lowering your guard for Gene Palmer, allowing the inmates to manipulate him, and civilian Joyce Mitchell, an easy, classic target. Low self-esteem and needed to be built up, something the inmates look for. Now, again, the cells at Clinton Correctional, from what I can see, and we can ask the people at Clinton what their cell sizes are, depending on the location and the dorms, but the one-man cells are usually 6x9, 6x8 one-man cells. That's the bare minimum standard by the fire codes and by the sanitation and safety codes. A one-man inmate cell should be around 6x9 or 6x8. Not a big cell. Why do I keep talking about the sizes of the cells at Alcatraz and Clinton? Because if you're an officer going in to do a cell search, and you do your cell search properly, you're going to find these holes in the wall, and I'm putting pictures up as I go to give you a visual of what they should have found and did not. Any prison escape in any prison in the United States, from what I found investigating 4 escapes myself when I was with the Inspector General's office, working with local law enforcement, working with the prison officers on escapes and canines, and when I was a prison correctional officer. My experience is every escape's going to have some elements in it. Complacency somewhere took place among an officer or a civilian employee. Inmate manipulation took place somewhere along the line to aid the inmates in making this escape work, because inmates will look for the weakest link, and they will pick the weakest links on the day of the escape. They will escape when they know the weakest officers are on duty. And corruption. Somebody somewhere may have been paid off. Not in every case. Inmate manipulation and complacency, I believe you're going to find in every inmate escape. But corruption could be added in there on some of the cases where officers were paid off to look the other way. We'll never know if that really happened at Alcatraz or not. But when you take all these into factor, all these escapes in Alcatraz and Clinton Correctional Institution could have been stopped with one officer, just one officer doing a good, thorough cell search. Okay? And these 2 escapes would have never taken place. They wouldn't be in our history books. They wouldn't be in our record books. 53 years apart from the old turnkey days at Alcatraz, and the lever that you pull to open the cells, to 53 years later, with all the technology we have and all the equipment we have to make things better and help prevent escapes, the human element still there, and the human element was used against the prison security by the inmates by using good old inmate manipulation and watching for complacency among officers, taking advantage of officers not doing cell searches, and taking advantage of no one doing prison shakedowns, checking their inventory for missing items. So that is my summarization of the two and how they compare, and I think they are so close in the way things were done. It's amazing to me. 6 months preparation by the inmates in each case, contraband, holes in their cells, none of it was caught by security staff. It just goes to show you, doesn't matter how high tech we get, the human element's always there, and that's what the inmates are going to look for. They're going to watch for that. I'll give you another escape scenario real quick. The escape from the Mexican prisons by El Chapo. Of course, he had all the elements there. He picked the weakest link. He picked the weakest officer to help him. That officer was caught and fired and placed in prison himself over in Mexico. Corruption was big time in there among officials of the prison system, and inmate manipulation. El Chapo was an expert manipulator, as was David Sweet and Richard Matt, and as was, in my opinion, the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris. They had to be good manipulators because they got a hold of all these things they needed some way or another. And although we can't prove it on the Alcatraz side, I'm sure inmate manipulation was a big factor. And I know complacency was a big factor in the Alcatraz escape. So why are we talking about all these factors? Because I'm trying to get the point across that you as a correctional officer should never, ever let your guard down, get the wrong mindset, become complacent, and never let inmates manipulate you. Because an escape or escapees, inmates who escape from prison, present a clear and present danger to our community. And during the escapes, a clear and present danger to our prison staff. So please, never let any of these three elements get into your head. Stay strong. Do your security checks properly, on time, document them, and do your random surprise cell searches on a regular or irregular basis to catch the inmates off guard and catch those inmates working on an escape plan. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe. Gary York, True Prison Stories.